Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay, and today I'd like to talk with you about antibiotic resistance. This is a problem we've been seeing more and more. The CDC says that there's been an increase of 30 to 40% in the use of our strongest antibiotics, which indicates that our frontline antibiotics are not as effective as they used to be. It's estimated that by 2050, more people will die of antibiotic-resistant infections than they do of cancer. So what is antibiotic resistance? Antibiotic resistance is a classic example of natural selection. A microbe is exposed to an antibiotic, and they build up defenses to that antibiotic using genetic mutation. They can then transfer those genetic mutations through horizontal gene transfer, and if a microbe dies, they can sometimes release fragments of their DNA into the environment, which can then get picked up by other microbes and used in their own DNA. So they are building up these defenses and they're sharing them with each other. And because it is a natural selection process, it is inevitable that they're going to build up those defenses, but together we can slow down that rate of resistance. The CDC has a program called the Antibiotic Stewardship Program, which is a really important concept because antibiotics are a lot different from our other medications. So stewardship means that you're managing something in a sustainable way, which is exactly what we want to do with our antibiotics because they build up those defenses. If you take an ibuprofen every day, you're not going to affect the integrity of that medication and you're not going to affect its ability to be used in the future. But if you do the same thing with an antibiotic, then the more microbes are going to be exposed to it and build up defenses, so you run the risk of it not working in the future, which is something we've been seeing. So there are two areas that I'd like to talk about today where we can improve our antibiotic stewardship. The first is in medicine and the second is in agriculture. So we'll start with medicine. This is the area where we typically think of antibiotics. If we get sick, we get an antibiotic, or if you've had a surgery, you get an antibiotic. And there are two areas within that there are some problems. One is something that individually we can't do that much about, and the other is something that we can definitely do something about. So the first is that it takes a long time to diagnose an infection in a lot of cases. And the reason for that is if you have an infection and they take a sample of it, they then have to grow that sample in a culture, and then they have to wait for it to grow, they have to diagnose it, and then they have to call and contact patients with a treatment plan, which can take a long time, especially when you have hundreds to thousands of patients to contact every day. So the things that we can't really do anything about individually is improving that diagnosis process. But there are researchers working on faster testing. In some cases, it can take hours instead of days to diagnose something, which really helps to improve our diagnosis rates. The CDC says that 30% of all prescribed antibiotics are unnecessary, and this is part of that problem, is that we don't have fast enough testing. So in some cases, they will give an antibiotic and it may not be the right one, or they give an antibiotic just to be safe, and then they get the diagnosis back and realize that they didn't need one. So individually, we can just support that research and wait for better technology to come out. But the other area is something we can definitely do individually, and that is to be better patients. We are not great patients sometimes. In antibiotics, an example would be if you get an antibiotic that you're supposed to take for a week, you only take it for 4 or 5 days and you start to feel better, so you put it up in the cabinet and forget about it and use it next time, or you share it with someone else. And that's a problem because you're not finishing out the antibiotic, so there is a likelihood that that infection isn't fully resolved. So it may have dropped down the rate of those microbes to the point where symptoms are resolving, but if you stop taking antibiotics early, the remaining microbes can not only recreate that same infection by building up their numbers again, but those remaining ones can also start to develop resistance because they were exposed to that antibiotic the first time. And the other thing is you don't want to be sharing with other people because they may not need that same antibiotic, or they may not need an antibiotic at all, and we don't know that. So keeping them to yourself and taking them as prescribed is imperative. Another area that we could improve as patients is to not push our providers to give us antibiotics. A lot of times, if you pester your health provider enough, they're going to give you one. I'd say you bring your child in with a ear infection and the doctor thinks that it could resolve on its own, but you really insist on those antibiotics, they're likely to give you one just to make you happy. So what we can do instead of asking for antibiotics is ask if they're necessary. So if they're giving you one, or if you want one but don't really want to push them, you can ask them if they're necessary, and they can give you the reason why they're not giving you that antibiotic so that you have a better understanding of the situation. The second area is agriculture. 80% of all antibiotics used are used in agriculture. And there are three reasons why. And the first is treatment of animals. So you have a farm full of chickens and one of them gets sick, so then you treat that chicken. The other is preventative care. So that same chicken that's sick could get other chickens sick. So what they do is treat all of them to prevent infection from spreading. And the third is the most controversial, which is they found that when they started using antibiotics the first time in animals, they found that it improves growth. So an animal will grow faster and in less hygienic conditions if given antibiotics. So with these three areas, it can be difficult to draw the line of what is appropriate for antibiotics and what isn't, especially when it comes to preventative care, because you don't want an entire population becoming ill and then having to be treated anyway. You'd rather just give them an antibiotic beforehand so that they don't get sick at all. But that kind of muddies the line between what is preventative care and what is for growth purposes. So if you're giving them a low dose antibiotic all the time and saying it's preventative, it could actually be for growth purposes, and there's not really a way to prove either way of that. So those three areas, they all contribute to antibiotic resistance. And the reason why is because every time we use an antibiotic, there's a chance of resistance. So if we're treating animals all the time with them, especially at a low dose rate, so less so individual treatments most of the time, because if they have an acute illness, they're going to get a stronger dose of antibiotics. But if they're in preventative care or if it's for growth purposes, they're receiving a low dose all the time in their food or water. And this means that all the microbes in those animals and around those animals are exposed to those antibiotics all the time. So they have a good chance of developing resistance. And they've seen this in some of the antibiotics, in some research they've done. They actually did research on an antibiotic that we don't use in human medicine, which is tetracycline, and they tested it, and it actually accelerates resistance to cephalosporins, which are an antibiotic that are a staple to human medicine. So there is a lot of reason to think that giving low-dose antibiotics to such a large volume of animals all the time would develop resistance and become a problem. But the catch to that is there's not a lot of research to prove that it's causing a big problem, even though we have an idea that it is. So what we can do for agriculture to be better stewards of antibiotics is to do more research to see where we're having the biggest problems. Because it's not quite reasonable to say that we shouldn't use antibiotics unless absolutely necessary, because that disrupts a lot of other balances like economics, where if farmers are just no longer able to use antibiotics, then it can drive up prices of food. It can cause companies to go bankrupt, and there's a lot to that that I'm not going to get into necessarily. But we can look at research and get research to see where we can improve our antibiotic use and to see where we can replace antibiotic use with vaccination, which would help a lot with reducing resistance in those environments. And as consumers, we can help drive this a little bit because our opinion matters to companies, because if we're not buying their product, they're not making money. So if we're concerned about antibiotic resistance, they're going to allow more research to be done on their properties, and hopefully they'll allow more research to be done there on their properties, and we can see where we can start making goals and taking action towards antibiotic stewardship. So together we can become better stewards, we can become better patients, we can become better consumers, and we can do more research. I do invite you to look at the links that I have below to other bigger and better speakers than I am. This is just a brief touch on these topics, with the main point being that we do need to be more responsible about our use of antibiotics. We want to have enough time to develop alternatives or more antibiotics or whatever the route ends up being. We want more time with that, so we don't want our current antibiotics that are stable to our health to stop being effective before we have other alternatives. Thank you so much for listening. This was my presentation on antibiotic resistance. I'm Lindsay, and check out those links below.